Marc Lewis, welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks, Rob. It's a pleasure to be here.
I say this every single time with people because it is normally me on the who's messed things up schedule-wise, but I know your schedule is particularly tough, so I'm really glad to get you on, line up schedules, and have a little chat. But if anyone doesn't know who you are, Marc, would you be able to give us a brief overview of where you've been, what you've done, and what you're doing now? Because I know you've got an interesting story.
Yeah, sure. I'll go ahead and give you a little background in terms of how I got to where I am. Little, I guess, non-traditional path in terms of I didn't go to high school. I didn't have a normal. I played high school sports. Went into college, studied exercise science or sports science, and then transitioned into career. So. I actually grew up in a really different environment. Didn't have parents, didn't have family. Lived temporarily with a lot of different people. Was in social services part of the time. Actually ended up being homeless as a teenager. Got emancipated at 16, and working just at a restaurant with a construction company, living in Section 8 housing. And then basically the military was my way out. So I ended up being an airborne infantryman in the Army. That was the first time I remember I was so excited when I got to boot camp because you didn't have to worry about where your meals come from. You always had somewhere to sleep. You had health insurance. You had, you could anything you needed. And it was mind blowing. And so I had a lot of fun. And when I went to boot camp, I was like, this is awesome. So that actually, I went in as just a basic infantryman, 11 Bravo contract. And then when I got into basic, I did quite well. And so I was able to get some other opportunities just because I was so excited to be there. And I was, really enthusiastic how I did everything. I really loved, I fell in love with physical preparation in the military, running, physical training. And then actually on one of the deployments, I stumbled upon through basically having someone that worked in administration with our unit that had studied exercise science in college. I started reading some anatomy and physiology books that he had just because I was really obsessed with training. And so he's like, hey, you might enjoy these. You can learn a little more about, how the body works, things like that. So I just, on deployments, I became obsessed with reading, physiology, anatomy, biomechanics. And then from there, I went to college, my undergrad from Wake Forest University in exercise science. And so there I started this trend of, I was really obsessed with research and understanding research methodology, how to systematically answer questions. And I just became obsessed with being in the lab. I was one of those annoying students who was always around his professors when they were in their office or in their lab and like asking questions and all of that. And so really that's where I started this path of having one foot in research, and then on the other side, I really enjoyed coaching. I really enjoyed being on the field. I enjoyed being on the court. I enjoyed being in the weight room. And so, doing strength conditioning internships, working as a personal trainer. So I had one foot in research, and then one foot, on the field, on the court, in the weight room. So I started this trend, and that kind of continued throughout grad school, and being able to understand, okay, how do you systematically answer questions, and how do you use different types of statistics to appropriately analyze. And then learning how to use a lot of different types of technology, instrumentation, and then on the other side, the relational part, working with athletes, working with coaches, understanding how to apply information. And so that kind of training kind of followed me. So I went and did my master's in exercise physiology, and then really when I got into sports science was so new in terms of these applied positions. So most of the sports scientists that I knew were academics practicing, and then the sports scientists in applied settings seemed to be, in the UK, where they seem to be in these one-off type scenarios, to where it wasn't a career where you saw all teams had sports scientists. It just, and so thinking about what I was going to do with my career. I knew what I loved, but it was just how can I take everything I love and turn it into a job. And so when I got to my PhD at Virginia Tech, I I was in this scenario where there was an academic there who was using stat sports, uh, you know, integrated microtech units, tracking load on women's soccer players. He was using it as part of a research study, and then communicating a little bit with coaches. And then there was in terms of strength coaches, there were strength coaches there that I knew through my strength coach network. So I was coaching as just a volunteer strength coach, doing my PhD next phys, working with this individual, and there was no sports scientists in at that university. And so I just kind of started going, door to door, so to speak, to different coaches and seeing how I could help them have information that might be useful. Asking other strength coaches. So the strength coaches I didn't know there, I started having conversations with them like, hey, how can potentially, we use information or use data and to help inform decision making around what, training or around practice. And so I kind of just started doing the job of a sports scientist there at that university. And then I ended up working primarily with football in terms of they had just got stat sports as well, and they had all this information coming in. And then because of my background kind of being in strength conditioning and in research, I was able to, I knew strength coaches, and I kind of had the understanding of being a strength coach in terms of how this information be utilized, some of the logistics, being able to actually talk to strength coaches in ways they understand. But at the same time, I knew how to appropriately analyze data, how to appropriately store and manage data, and what that information might be telling us. So it wasn't just we're going to look at max velo all day. And so I think from that really helped me integrate well into their football strength staff there. And so one of my mentors and good friends to this day, Ben Hilgart, was the head strength coach there, and he's just a fantastic person, kind of an old school strength coach in terms of mentality, but at the same time, really open to new ideas, new ways of thinking, innovative. I really appreciated, his as we integrated this information there and kind of got it going. My role expanded to where I became the director of sports science there. And then when, as a position opened up on their strength staff, I also became the associate director of strength conditioning there. And so working with the football team there. And so as my role expanded, I was a coaching role, it was a sports science role, and we were able to do more and more there, starting from scratch basically. And so from there, I was at Penn State University as the associate director of performance science. I got to work with one of the best people I know there, Josh Nelson, who I know we've talked a little bit about him. He's absolutely fantastic. One of the best people you'll ever meet, but also just in terms of his skill set, one of the best planners, long-term planners, organizers, and he's fantastic at being able to think in terms of high performance. So while I was at Penn State, that's really, I think, what I became better at, stepping outside of the sports science and being in the weeds and really trying to understand how, a high performance unit works, bringing synergy across different areas, and being able to step back and empower others to do their jobs, and really being able to, bring a lot of different areas together in one cohesive unit. And so that's really the time I spent there. I really enjoyed it with Nelly. And then coming down to the Texans, I was fortunate enough to get the opportunity to come down and join the Houston Texans. I initially joined as their applied sports science coordinator, and then we had some restructuring here, going to more of a high performance model, to where we now have a high performance director for sport performance and a medical director for our athletic training, return to sport, and then kind of our medical side. And so with that, I moved up into the position of director of applied sports science here, and I've been here for about 6.5 months now, and absolutely love it. And I get to work with fantastic people. We have such a great crew here. Obviously, Matt Van Dyke's been here a while. Matt's a great friend. I like to think in terms of we're a little bit of the dynamic duo in terms of we just every day we're into something, and like being able to talk with him and being able to if you're around people that challenge you, kind of that iron sharpens iron mentality. Obviously, Ryan Grubbs is here, fantastic in terms of being one of the smartest people in terms of speed development and sprint mechanics. So we just have a lot of fantastic people. I could give you a list, but we have just I'd like to think one of the best performance staffs, if not the best performance staff in the NFL.
I think it's a first, well, it's definitely the first time we've had two people who've got the same position because of promotion, with Matt coming on the podcast when he was in, was it the same job title as what you've got, and then he's moved up and you've taken his? Okay.
Yeah, it's so funny because
first time it's come around.
He came to the Texans as the sports science coordinator, then got promoted to director. And then I came here as the coordinator, got promoted to director. So I just keep following him. And I nearly took over for him at Texas when he was at Texas. I actually was offered the job behind him. So it was funny because we talk about it all the time because we kind of almost following each other around, and like the position. Our resumes are going to look exactly the same at the end of the day, nearly.
Right. Let's dive in. And we've got some load monitoring type discussion. We've got some understanding acute fatigue and a little bit about recovery as well. But we'll go into the load monitoring to start with. And just, I think what might frame the discussion quite nicely is trying to understand the demands of American football. How have you gone about that? Because it's not like other sports when you've got different positions, and you've got different demands, but the demands on positions in American football are extremely different. So how do you try to understand that and quantify that to help push things forward?
Sure. Yeah. I think I love what you said. Like it's really, the demands are diverse. How you monitor your interior guys has to be different than how you monitor your skills playing on the outside. Just their jobs, from what they look like physically, to the qualities that are most important for them, to what they actually do in practice and in games is just really different. I think in a lot of times in our world, people want one measure, two measures, and then just start across the whole squad. But in football, you just can't do that. So I think breaking it up by position groups and having different metrics. One of the things I did when I was at Virginia Tech is I took a lot of our practice data over the course of about 2 years, and then broke it up by position groups. And I did I did a principal components analysis, looking basically at which metrics explain most of the variance within these different position groups. And as you can imagine, and as you just kind of pointed out, like because of the diversity across these different positions, there were very different metrics explaining most of the variance between these different position groups. And so boiling it down to, a handful of metrics that represent volume and intensity for each position group, and then tracking those consistently over time, I think is the best way to go about it. But yeah, it's the demands are very different. Because of that, you really do have to look at different metrics, for your different positions.
Without listing them out, because that'd be a pretty dry. But in terms of, can you give us some examples of maybe the particular metrics that you'd look at for one position group, and then another one, maybe some things that caught you off guard when you did that analysis of, oh, okay, I didn't realize that would be so important to drill down into for that position group or that position group?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll give you a couple of good examples here. So obviously it's really important on your skills, the guys that play on the outside. So wide receivers, DBs, you have to monitor, their high speed yardage. So sprint yardage, thinking of anything 90% or greater, high speed running, that 80 to 90% range, and then moderate speed running 70 to 80%. So those are going to be considerable. So the high speed, the sprinting, that's the harder stuff. That's the stuff that's going to explain most of the variance. So basically be able to tell you the guys that had a harder day versus the guys that maybe had a lower day. And so with that, the number of efforts, so being able to contextualize that distance a little more. So the number of efforts you're going to have, the sprinting efforts, the high speed running efforts, and then the accelerations and decelerations. And so that harder stuff, the more intense stuff that's really going to involve around running for your skills, those are going to be the things you want to pay attention to. But that obviously anyone that's watched the the sport of American football will be able to tell you that is not what your linemen do. That is not what your interior players do. And so depending on what system you're using, whether you're using Catapult, whether you're using Stat Sports, the metrics will be a little different. But Catapult, I think, is mostly used in American football. There are teams that do use Stat Sports, but for this purpose, we'll go with Catapult. I think you're really trying to get at with them a lot of their load is static load. It's these a smaller, really aggressive movements, but smaller movements, and they're not covering as much distance. So going to a metric like an IMA and quantifying that by different bands. So IMA low, IMA mid, IMA high, being able to have a volume intensity combined metric that picks up these micro movements.
Sorry to interject, Mark.
Mm-hmm.
What's I'm going to ask the question of what is IMA. Now, I used to work at Catapult, and we used to get that question asked a lot. And at the time, this was 2016, I don't think we even had a great answer to that. But I'd love to get, and I mean, I've got old since then, so I'm not over Catapult metrics. But what's your understanding of IMA?
Sure. So an inertial movement analysis is what IMA stands for. And in terms of again, and I'll touch on this after, but you can combine it and make it volume intensity where you're looking at it in different bands, which I think Pat Ward has put out some tremendous work on the quantifying these more load metrics. Same thing with player load, where you combine volume and intensity to be able to to be a little more efficient in what you're looking at with your data. But sure. So IMAs basically are these micro movements, changes of direction, regardless of orientation, to where you're basically, if you think about it, if you think about what a lineman does, or if you think about someone that might move within a very small space to where they're not triggering an acceleration, they're not triggering a deceleration, they're not really moving their body enough to trigger some of these other movements, and they're not reaching a high velocity or anything, but they're making body movements that are really aggressive within a small area. I like to think about it, a lineman, you're really working within a 2 to 3 yard box, and you're going to be hitting someone, you're going to be coming into contact, creating static load, you're going to be moving to your left, moving to your right, pulling, whatever it is, within a small area. But those are really aggressive movements. The body's moving, you're moving fast, you're just not going to trigger anything from a running load, or from a running standpoint in terms of an acceleration that's greater than 4 meters per second squared, or you're not going to trigger anything like that. So it could go unnoticed. And on player load, if you're looking at just an arbitrary like load number, that's going to be driven more by just duration than anything else. So even from an intensity standpoint, you could go out there and have a really short burst and of these micro movements where you're blocking, where you're pulling, where you're really intense movements and really intense load, but it's not getting quantified appropriately. And so that's where, again, having the something to quantify that with the IMA and these micro movements, but then also quantifying that across a band to where if it's high, mid, or excuse me, low, mid, or high, then you're able to really be able to, and that's measured in G's. And then in terms of being able to actually quantify what's happening in this for their load. And so that's, again, for interior guys, really what their demands are, and how you're going to explain most of the variance in their load, which is ultimately what you're trying to get at, being able to understand who had harder days, higher days, if you use high-low models or whatever, and who had easier days or lower days. And that's what you're able to do, when you find these metrics that explain most of that variance among your data.
I know concussion and collision is obviously a big thing for you guys, as it is over here with rugby. How are you trying to get an understanding of impacts and amount of tackles and things like that? I don't know if is there any advancement in, I don't know if it be a catapult thing with like helmet, mouth guards, sensors in pads, all that kind of thing, to try to take that conversation on and understand it a little bit better?
Yeah, so that's not something we really do here too much in terms of I have in so when I was at Virginia Tech, there was a lot of concussion research happening. We had individuals there. There's an excellent concussion lab there at that university, and so I tracked impacts in part to help build a data set to help them have this accelerometer data to go with the data they're collecting that was much more advanced. But they wanted to overlay that data. And there is, I think, like obviously you have, again, depending on what company you work with, they're called different things. But with Stat Sports, you had these impact bands, and with these impact bands, you could just again quantify it categorically. These different impact levels, tied to different, to different G's, and then from there, you could overlay that with some of the concussion data.
Is that something that I don't want to ask you things that you're not comfortable in saying, because I know it's, certain things stay in-house, but is that something that you do at the Texans in terms of trying to understand level of impacts for these guys
No,
to periodize? Okay.
we actually don't really do that here, just in terms of kind of the scope of what we do. We don't use any of that information in conjunction with anything that our sports med team is doing in regards to concussion research. But that is a really interesting area, and I think that I've had a few conversations with folks. Andy Ryland and I talked a lot about this last summer when prepping for fall camp. When I was at Penn State, he came up there and visited, and we talked a lot about this. Just because of how there's essentially progressions to collisions and where contact prep is so important because of the inefficiencies in contact and tackling, and how that drives up your impacts, the magnitude of impacts, because of how inefficient you are when you haven't tackled for however many months, and then all of a sudden you start hitting all over and tackling, and like how that in American football, there's a lack of proper progression and preparation for the reintroduction of contact. If there's been a long time between, like you go from spring ball to fall camp, you've got a whole summer of lag where there's been no contact, and you've just been running routes, you've just been skills and drills type thing. And so by the time you get to the season, or by the time you get to camp, you're introducing pads. There's not really been a contact prep progression, and so there's now a lot more of that being incorporated, thanks in large part to Andy's work in educating folks and getting information out there. But there's several universities, and I'm not as familiar with people in the NFL doing it, but I know there's several universities that are really using more contact prep based training for conditioning purposes, specific, especially to your interior guys having to leverage bodies, move bodies, and then for connective tissue health, for mobility, for the conditioning that's more, you're going to have to move bodies, handle bodies, and so being able to do it, but then also prepping them for tackling, prepping them for being able to progress into contact in a more incremental, systematic way of progression, as opposed to just we're running all the time and then all of a sudden we're hitting.
Is that something that is in the remit of your job to help that progression, or is that specifically a technical thing?
I will say where we're at right now, we're in a first year of a new coaching staff, and I don't know where we'll be, but there's definitely folks here where we've had these conversations and things. But I honestly, like, that's, I think those are things that we would love to get to, but currently it's not anything that we do. And I will say that I think you're going to see more and more teams utilizing contact prep and trying to progress more to by the time you get to pads, trying to progress to how collisions introduced and how contacts introduced. And so I think you're going to see more and more of that. But yeah, that's something we've definitely had discussions about with different folks here, but not anything that we really emphasize right now.
Cool. Right. I'm just gonna hone in on the speed guys, the guys that are gonna get the highlight reels. They're the ones that are going to be featured on the TV on a Sunday or a Monday. How are you periodizing, and you from a load perspective, making sure they're prepared to run fast but not over prepared to run fast in the week, so they're cooked. In terms of a loading perspective, how are you managing that throughout a week from a Saturday to Saturday or Sunday to Sunday? And what impact are you having on that in terms of, or do you want to have on that in terms of injury reduction and just general physical preparation?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, we really try to lock in our load progressions. It's a little different than NFL because in college you have all your guys there all summer, so you're prepping them for fall camp. Um, and you're able to control a lot more of the variables. Our strength coach here, Mike Eubanks, he's fantastic. But anyway, we were talking the other day, and he equated it to in college you're able to fly the plane with the door closed, but in the NFL you're kind of flying the plane with the door open because you can't control very much. You don't know who's going to be there every day. You're trying to plan an ideal way to progress guys, but then you don't know who's going to be there on a day-to-day basis because it's not mandatory, and you have a lot less control over what they're doing. I mean, you may have a guy, that's there half the week, then leaves on vacation for a week, then comes back for a day, then leaves. Like, you just don't know, and so you're really trying to build this plan of, okay, we're gonna sit here and we're gonna plan this ideal progression of what their higher speed work's going to be, what their COD series is going to look like, and how we're going to progress their decel work, and how we're going to progress in the weight room what they're doing. And then when it comes down to it, you've got, okay, these guys have been here most of the time, or these guys have been here all the time, these guys have been here most of the time, these guys have been here sometimes, we don't know what these guys have done, and you're just trying to piece it all together to make sure that ultimately you're giving them something that's not going to injure them, that's going to help them progress and that they can handle. And it's really challenging. So we do really try to plan our progressions, and we try to, as we get guys in and out and we're not sure what they've done, we try to talk to them and figure out what they've done. And we also try to keep up with it, just in terms of like informing each other. If we know, this guy's, went out and ran routes, last week when he wasn't here, he was in wherever running routes. Okay, well, we know he's getting some work in there versus another guy. Hey, we're not sure about him. I've asked and I'm not really clear, on what he's been doing. So we try to have those conversations on a daily basis, but yeah, absolutely preparing the tissue, the hamstring musculature for high speed work, and progressing in small incremental doses, and then trying to back off at certain times to allow adaptations to occur and prepare them for next adaptation phases. Like we plan all of that and talk all of that out over the off season program, and then trying to introduce that and trying to prepare them. Ultimately, too, what we're trying to do is, in our controlled, non-chaotic environment, we're trying to overdose the higher speed work and try more than what they're going to see in camp, and then being able to have it from a physical output standpoint, an actual step back when we go into camp, knowing that the integration of football, that's a lot of significant stressors from a cognitive load standpoint, the psychological stressors, the fact that you're out there all the time on your feet, and the fact that you're in this chaotic environment where these loads are not the same, and so trying to, in an ideal world, in our controlled, non-chaotic environment where we're running, build-ups and flies and linear accels, and we're doing, scripted COD series and as decent reactive work as you can do, but you can't simulate the chaotic environment of sport perfectly in S&C settings. And so, ultimately we're trying to build more of a cushion there from a physical output standpoint, to where they're going to do more in a week with us in the off season than what they're going to do in a week of the high speed running, of the sprinting, of the efforts, of what they're going to see in camp. And so I think we do a pretty good job of planning that out. It's just it's impossible for everyone to get that in the NFL, because everyone's never going to be there. And then the second piece of that is, there's going to be things that you just don't know about your guys going into camp because they haven't been around. And so it is very, very challenging, but that's kind of how we plan it out. And we do have, I like to think, a pretty good number of guys that actually do, for an NFL team, that actually do train here with us in the off season, and that are here 90% of the time for our sessions. And I think that's just a testament to the crew we have here. Mike's got great relationships with the players. It also probably doesn't hurt we're in Houston, Texas instead of Green Bay, Wisconsin. And so that probably helps guys wanting to be here in the summer. But, I think when you can the more you can make sure they're getting what they need to get and not too much, not too little, and being able to progress them, and you have more control over those loads, I think the better off you're going to be for reducing the likelihood of non-contact soft tissue type injuries when you're going into camp. Because, really, if anyone that's worked in football can tell you, the guys that are getting injured the first week at camp are probably guys that haven't been doing much over this. It's not because their loads are being mismanaged in camp. It's probably because they haven't been prepared adequately in the summer for whatever reason.
I love that analogy about the playing with the door wide open. Yeah, I do like that. It's wild. Like every time I hear people talk about who are on the ground in the NFL, like it's crazy, isn't it? Is there anything that you can do? We're gonna dive into the kind of acute fatigue side of things, but is there anything that you can do or do when it comes to the acute, I suppose, preparation in terms of surrogate measures that's not so you can get a better understanding of where the guys are without actually sprinting them and potentially injuring them? Is there anything that you can do there to get a bit of a better idea of what they actually have done and where they're at physically?
We try to, outside of just talking to them, we try to do different types of tests that give us an idea of where they're at. Our initial testing and I'll give you an example. Different types of tests we might implement. I'll try to be specific without being too specific, but basically, like, we'll look at everything from where their max strength is in something like an iso belt squat to how are they accelerating, how are they compared to their in like a 20-yard compared to where they've been previously. How do they look in between if we're running multiple reps? Like, how do they look physically when they get done with the rep? How do they look? If you're running something, not a conditioning test or anything like that, but if they're doing things that should be easy, does it look easy? Before we're introducing them to anything of max velocity or when we're doing flies or anything like that. Like, there's going to be things that we do and we're watching their body language. We're watching how they, okay, this should be easy for them. They should look smooth. If they're looking winded, if they're looking gassed, that's going to give you some insight. Obviously, measures we get on a force plate from some of depending on their position, we do different types of jumps. And so being able to get insight into, does it look like, have they fallen off any here? Kind of, again, just a holistic way of understanding, what do their measures look like from all these different qualities that we're assessing and then what we're doing. But then also just from, the coach's eye a little bit of, okay, we've got some pretty smooth tempos today. We're going to shorten the distance. It's not anything challenging, but how are they looking? Do they look smooth? Do they look winded in between? This is more than enough time for rest. Like so information like that, I think, can provide a lot of insight into what guys have been doing. Ultimately, you don't want to you don't want to give them too much of a stimulus and introduce them to something they're not prepared for. And so would rather understand and that they've not been doing what they've said they've been doing, or they've not been doing what you wanted them to do, and we're going to meet them where they're at in terms of the program, and we're not just gonna okay, well, today is a linear Excel max velo day and that's what we're doing. We will absolutely take them aside, and here, because of our staff, we are really able to go and have coaches go work with guys one-on-one or go take them aside. If we don't know what they've been doing, we will take them aside and go and kind of have a one-on-one session with them. Also, I think sometimes, like, if you want to slow them down, that's where using devices like the 1080, where you can add some resistance and you're slowing them down, but you can also you can get insight into conditioning. You can get insight into how they look mechanically. You can tell if a guy's not been moving a lot. Or if maybe, we're seeing something, with his left limb and how he's striking, how he's looking in his movement. And so then you can start a conversation. Well, yeah, I was on a flight last week and now my, left side's a little tight and like, I'm not, those are guys we want to get ahead of that and not have them, being introduced to max velo work and the types of more intense things we'd be doing in training. So we can go over and do things on the side and have different devices and different things we utilize to be able to give us more insight into what they've been doing, if there's pain or discomfort with anything. And because again, if you've not been seeing guys for weeks, anything could have happened in that time frame, stuff they could have forgotten about, and then they start doing something hard and then they remember, oh yeah, like I tweaked my back when a couple of weeks ago, and yeah, I don't quite feel right. And at this level, all of that matters, because every individual in our organization, like, they're there for a reason, and keeping them healthy and available impacts everyone. And so it's you want to be very dialed into what you're giving them, what you're doing with them, and whatever you can do to make sure they stay healthy and make sure they are getting what they need, not too much, not too little.
Perfect. Right. I teased it a little bit a minute ago around the acute fatigue monitoring. I know was this part of your PhD?
Yeah, I did do.
Yeah.
So for I had a couple of manuscripts in my dissertation looking at using the force plate to look at acute fatigue and time course of recovery in American football athletes.
Nice. Let's dive into that area. Now, we were speaking beforehand because I've spoke to Chris Bishop recently, who the Don when it comes to asymmetry, so it may feed into some of his discussion as well. But when it comes to understanding acute fatigue, I'm guessing this is something that you would dial in, especially in season, because the guys have got ready for the weekend. What protocols are you using? What metrics really matter, or have you come to understand really matter when it comes to acute fatigue and using force plates?
Sure. Yeah. So, I think my work with force plates really started in trying to understand, what metrics should we be looking at? Which ones are most sensitive to change? Which ones are most reliable? Which ones are going to provide you insight? Because what you don't want to do is you don't want metrics that are too sensitive, but at the same time, you don't want metrics that are telling you 2 days after, once a guy's so far into a hole that it's a multiple day issue, of non-functional overreaching, as opposed to being more sensitive and being able to say, okay, like, we can get ahead of this a little bit. We're seeing fatigue in these guys. Like, we can get ahead of this from emphasizing recovery to intervening with what they're doing in the weight room. Most of the fatigue monitoring obviously taking place in season, so trying to understand there's time points where fatigue is intended and planned, and making sure that, but there's also times where you want them fresher, and making sure that what you're planning is actually happening, and that where the amount of fatigue they're supposed to be under or expected is actually there, and that in an appropriate amount, and that their time course to recovery actually fits what you're planning and what you're expecting. And so I would preface it by saying that I think if you're using force plates to monitor your athletes, there are some metrics that we know are pretty reliable across most populations. I'll give jump height as an example. But if you're getting more nuanced with different types of metrics, if you're looking at asymmetry measures of like eccentric deceleration impulse, concentric impulse, if you're looking at these phase specific type metrics, which I think is the next level of what you want to do, you want to really look at the reliability within your population. So understanding the within individual coefficient of variation of these different metrics, and being able to know which ones you should be looking at. And the reason I say that's important within your population is because the more you test, the more your athletes are familiar with, let's use a standard hands on hips double leg counter movement jump. If you do that very frequently and you're consistent in your protocol, you're going to have much better reliability. And if you're consistent with who does it, then in some settings where you've got different interns every week, testing these guys, they may or may not be getting the same cues. You're not going to see the same reliability. You're not going to see the same CVs in those two examples. And so I think looking at which metrics do I want to look at? Which ones from the literature may show that they have good reliability? Now, what do they look like in my population, in the way I do things? Because ultimately, if you're looking at metrics that are changing, or you're looking at metrics and you're wanting to look at change, and you can't be sure that change is going to be greater than the CV, then you could be looking at noise or just standard biological variability. And so I think I think ultimately being able to understand reliability of the metrics you want to look at and have that help determine which metrics you look at is the best way to go about it. And so some of the metrics that I think are useful from a performance standpoint, I kind of think about them in terms of, Rob Gaither-Cole's work in this area in terms of strategy and output metrics. And then obviously now, there's been Chris Bishop, Matt Jordan come out with a lot of good information in terms of which metrics to look at. But I think probably some of the more popular ones, so like RSI, for example, great metric to look at that kind of is a catch-all a little bit in terms of you're getting an output. So you're getting jump height as part of that ratio, and then you're getting contraction time. So how long they're spending to achieve a given jump height. And so I think that's one that a lot of people use. I think to your point, Chris had the paper where, you really do have to pick apart these ratios to understand what's changing. And so being able to understand, okay, if my jump height's staying the same, but my contraction time's, going down, then that's a positive adaptation. That's a positive response to a training stimulus. At the same time, if my jump height's staying the same and my contraction time's going down, that's I would say a first indication of fatigue. Okay. If your contraction time's going down and your jump height's going down, okay, now that's an indication that the type of fatigue you're dealing with is more significant, because they're not even able to change their strategy to achieve a given output. And generally, athletes can compensate, change a strategy to achieve a given output or given performance standard. And if they can't even achieve what's a normal performance standard for them, even changing their strategy, then I would say that's where you see a little bit more of that. If using the kind of fatigue or the fatigue spectrum, so to speak, you're kind of getting into that non-functional overreaching world where there's considerable fatigue being built up over the course of multiple days, so more of the residual fatigue as opposed to acute fatigue. Really, I think that I think is ultimately when you're looking at any of these ratios or when you're looking at these metrics, being very purposeful in what you're looking at and making sure that you're looking at things that represent different parts of the movement. And so again, for something like the counter movement jump, if you're looking at changes, so symmetry on force plates, another big area. But if you're looking at changes in symmetry, being able to represent, okay, eccentric deceleration impulse represents, the unweighting and the braking phase of the jump versus, concentric impulse representing the propulsive phase. So being able to split up to where you're looking at different phases of the movement as opposed to you're just looking at a bunch of outcomes from the propulsive phase. So I think that's pretty important too in selecting which metrics you look at.
And when we're talking about reliability, we were talking beforehand about looking at on an individual level and the importance of looking at and understanding that versus applying that to the group and then potentially having, outliers either way.
Yeah, absolutely. So when thinking about reliability, again, within the individual, so depending on what your testing frequency is, you can look at, within session, CVs. So understanding the variation within 3 to 5 jumps, typically 3 is what you'll see with the counter movement jump. So 3 jumps. So what is the variation within that particular session? And then between sessions, what's the retest reliability? If you're standardizing when you test, you can look at that, through using doing interclass correlation coefficients and looking at retest reliability. Again, if you standardizing when you test and you're able to compare that, I think ultimately being able to understand the coefficients of variation within sessions and being able to compare your percent change to the coefficients of variation is a good way to go about seeing if is my change real change. And then obviously you can use effect sizes to look at magnitude of change to understand, is this a large negative change? Is this a very large negative change, giving you more perspective on the magnitude of change. But first and foremost, you have to understand, is the change I'm seeing real, or is it? And I think the best way to explain it that I always, when I'm talking to people about it, is I say, think about the CV percentage as noise and the percent change as a signal, and the signal has to be greater than the noise. Otherwise, you don't know if you're just looking at, measurement error and biological variability versus actual real change that's taking place.
When it comes to the protocols that you're using to try to understand this, is this game day? Is this the day after game day, or are you doing this systematically throughout that post-game period so you can tailor recovery, you can modify training, all that kind of stuff? Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I've done it different ways. Doing it the day after the game, where you're expecting, okay, the guys are going to, we expect fatigue to be here. The reason to do it the day after the game, in my opinion, is that you're able to then look at the time course of recovery over the week. If you wait till later in the week where you're expecting them to be recovered, then you're not able to understand that time course over the week, which I think is important and ultimately helps over time being able to understand and get ahead of things. Because if you're jumping, I know in some protocols, people might jump towards the end of the week because the theory being, I know they're fatigued early in the week. We don't need information telling us what we already know. We'll just look late in the week and then see. But the problem with that, I think, is that if you're waiting till a day before the game or 2 days before the game to see if they're fatigued, then in American football, again, thinking that if we play once a week, if you're waiting till the end of the week, your time for an intervention point and getting ahead, I mean, you don't really have much time, especially given like if you're traveling and doing these other elements, like there's not a lot you can control because generally, depending on what model, Friday is going to be if you're testing on like a Thursday and you play on a Saturday, Friday is going to be a short day anyway. There's not really any weightlifting going on. There's not much you can do at that point. You're just saying, well, this person's not where they should be. So if you start earlier in the week, I think it gives you a better idea. And then over time, you're able to okay, this guy, this is week 5 and he's normally about, again, like depending how you're analyzing the information, but let's say, we normally see, about a large negative change. So we're normally about a standard deviation or 1.5 standard deviations below on RSI. And now all of a sudden he's 2.5 standard deviations. Like that's not his norm. All right. For whatever reason, maybe it's as simple as he just had a lot more playing time and a lot more reps in the game. Maybe it's like, hey, like he had a tough game, but then also he just didn't respond well in terms of like, maybe it was emotionally draining, whatever it was. But for whatever reason, he's below where we normally see him. I now have a week to be able to say, okay, like I've got weightlifting sessions that I can modify if needed. I've got practices that I can modify based on whatever system you run. You could modify those. You have time for recovery. You have time for assessments. Like maybe this is tied to something that's maybe this is tied to something to do with a limb that's bothering him or something or some type of discomfort that he's having. Like there's all these different possibilities, but you have 5 days to figure that out, as opposed to at the end of the week, I find out this guy's not where he should be. And now it's just basically, I know that going into the game. And so I think from my standpoint, it's really important. Okay, day after the game and then sometime midweek. And then if you can do an ideal world towards the end of the week, but at the very least after the game. And then on like a Thursday, if you're playing college and you're playing on Saturday, obviously that would be pushed back a day if you're in the NFL setting and playing on Sunday. But basically where you're, game day -2 testing into the week, and you're testing game day +1 on after the game.
Last thing, because I know you've got to get to the facility not too distant future. Is there any particular recovery methods that you use, or have you standardized methods based off how each player reacts to that acute fatigue monitoring, or is it very much on an individual basis? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think so. There's layers to that. I think first and foremost, when you're monitoring fatigue, I think why are you monitoring the fatigue? I think one, you're seeing if what you planned actually happens. So if it's meant to be, like, where are you at in the training cycle? Where are you at in terms of what that training session should have been, and is that level of fatigue expected? if it's an adaptation cycle, if you're in the off season and fatigue's expected, like facilitating recovery is not going to be a primary option, or not going to be a priority, because maybe you want the body naturally, to respond to that stress, and there's adaptations to occur. You don't need to facilitate expedited recovery. But if you're in season and you're trying to expedite recovery, I think the low hanging fruit is making sure they're, from a sleep nutrition standpoint. In the NFL, even, that's one of the first things that you want to cover. If we're seeing guys, that recovery is a concern, we're seeing levels of fatigue that are beyond their norm, or with how we analyze that, and using, again, whatever you use, if you use Z-scores or whatever you use, but if you're seeing, okay, recovery is an issue, then sleep and nutrition, those being the first things that are covered. In terms of the modalities, I think there's some that we know where there's some evidence. So cold water immersion, I think, is one where we know there's some evidence supporting the efficacy of its use. There's a lot of others where I think I look at it this way: is the effect either going to be null, so there's no effect, or a positive effect? Then let's make it available and let the players kind of choose what they utilize. I think that's a win-win for a couple of reasons. One, there's going to be no harm done with them using it if it's a null effect or positive effect. And two, you're giving them some autonomy in choosing what they do, as opposed to saying, this is something you have to do. So what we do here, and what I think is probably the best approach, is having a lot of options available and kind of talking with them and helping them be educated on what these different options might be if they're new and they've not been exposed to these options. I think educating them on that, and then the options that we know, for example, CWI, where we're like, okay, there's some evidence here, especially given the time of season you're in. If you're in season, if you're in camp, and expedited recovery is the priority, then I think definitely being able to say, okay, we would like you to do this. We think this is helpful. There's research out, like you can educate them on that. I still think having, that's obviously a choice, but I think giving them some autonomy in it and making a lot of different options available, even if the scientific evidence may not be there to support its efficacy, I think it's still a good option in terms of recovery modalities. I think contrast therapy obviously is, we see efficacy with it, and there are others. I'm not comprehensive list, but we do have a range of things available. I will say that in terms of managing fatigue, I think what you do in the weight room is, in our sport, is the first place where you have complete control over that, as working in the performance side, and so that's the first place you can start making adjustments in what they do. And so whether that's changing from full range of motion squats, or whether that's taken away from volume, or saying we're going to take full range of motion, we're going to manipulate range of motion, we're going to do isometrics instead of full range of motion squats, or we're going to take we're going to reduce volume through reps, or reducing the number of sets, or whatever it is. I think that's the first kind of layer, and then after that, I think you can get into manipulating what they do in terms of practice reps, in terms of whether that's reducing overall reps, they're available all periods, and reducing reps, so rep capping them, or certain periods that may not be as important as others, in conversation with the coaches, to give them, to lighten their load on the day. And so all of these are being options, and kind of the flow, I think, in terms of how you manage fatigue, starting from like the low-hanging fruit of sleep and nutrition, through recovery modalities, through starting to manipulate their workloads in weight room, and then in on the field.
I can hear you getting pinged, so I hope that's not someone saying,
No,
Mark,
no,
come on, you're late.
It can't
Stop
be.
talking.
I'm sure. It can't be that important.
No, that's fine. But I am conscious that you've got to shoot in 18 minutes. So thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it. Again, apologies for the back and forth on my side, and you've got a very much a valid excuse because you're in the thick of it right now. So I appreciate you working around me. But anyone that wants to get to know you or your work or what you're doing day to day, what's the best place? Social media a good place?
Yeah, I'm pretty responsive on social media, Twitter and Instagram. Marc T. Lewis, MarcTLewis. And then obviously, if anyone wants to reach out via email, it's drmarklewis@gmail.com is my personal. So drmarclewis@gmail.com. That's my personal email. So I'm fairly responsive there. So either way is good, and I'm more than happy to talk shop with folks. I always enjoy connecting with people, and just learning about what other people are doing, and being able to talk shop a little bit, I think is a lot of fun. Obviously right now, not having as much time, but like during times where I have some weekends available or some evenings available, then I always like to jump on calls with folks and find out what people are doing, because you can always learn, always take a conversation away from someone, or have a conversation and take something away that's new, or just something to give you that you can think about and try to apply.
Love that. Well, thanks, Marc. Really appreciate it. Have a good rest of the day, and thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Rob. I had a blast.
Thanks, mate.